Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet journey through the annals of history. As you settle in for a restful slumber or a moment of peaceful reflection, I invite you to transport your mind to a distant time and place. Imagine, if you will, a realm of stone castles, grand tapestries, and regal pageantry, the world of medieval Europe. Before we embark on our exploration of the lives of royal women in this era, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from today. Whether it's morning, noon, or night in your corner of the globe, I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this time with me. If you enjoy this type of calm, historical storytelling, I warmly encourage you to subscribe so we can embark on many more adventures through the ages together. Now, let us gently step back in time to an age that is often romanticized in tales of chivalry and courtly love. But for the women of royal blood who lived in these times, life was often far from a fairy tale. Theirs was a world of great uncertainty, where political alliances could shift on a whim, and the very survival of dynasties rested on their shoulders. Picture yourself in a drafty, damp stone chamber, the flickering light of candles casting dancing shadows on the wall. This is the bedchamber of a medieval queen, a woman who, despite her lofty title, often faced a precarious and perilous existence. The grand tapestries and rich velvet curtains may create an illusion of warmth and comfort, but the reality for even the most highborn women of this time was often one of hardship and danger. In the pages of history books, we may catch glimpses of queens bedecked in jewels and crowned in gold, their names etched alongside those of kings. But the true stories of these women, their fears, their struggles, their triumphs, are often lost in the mists of time. Tonight, we'll endeavor to bring those stories to life once more, to illuminate the shadows of the past and pay tribute to the resilience and strength of the women who lived them. As we journey back to the Middle Ages, keep in mind that life for royal women was a constant balancing act between duty and survival. From the moment of their birth, princesses were viewed as valuable political commodities, their marriages arranged to forge alliances and secure peace between kingdoms. They were expected to be pious, virtuous, and above all, to provide heirs to secure the royal line. But in a world where the whims of men could determine the fate of nations, even the most exalted women lived under the constant threat of danger. Assassination, revolt, and warfare were ever-present spectres, lurking in the shadows of even the grandest castles. And in an age where medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, the very act of fulfilling their most essential duty, bearing children, could be a death sentence. Yet even in the face of such adversity, many royal women managed to carve out spheres of influence and leave their mark on history. Some ruled as regents in their husbands' stead, skillfully navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Others became patrons of the arts and learning, using their wealth and status to foster cultural growth. And a few, through sheer force of will and personality, managed to defy the conventions of their time and seize power in their own right. As we delve into the stories of these remarkable women, I invite you to let your imagination transport you to their world. Picture yourself walking the stone hallways of a medieval castle, the hem of your gown trailing on the rushes strewn across the floor. Imagine the weight of a jeweled crown upon your brow and the whispered intrigues of courtiers echoing in your ears. In the coming hours, we'll meet queens and princesses, duchesses and countesses, women who faced unimaginable challenges and yet left an indelible mark on the pages of history. So settle in, dear listener, and let the tales of these bygone heroines paint pictures in your mind as you drift off to a peaceful slumber. Our first stop on this journey through time will be the turbulent life of Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. Born in 1102, Matilda was destined from birth to be a pawn in the great game of medieval politics. As the only legitimate child of Henry I, she was his heir apparent, a status that would lead to a lifetime of struggle and strife. Matilda's early years were marked by the kind of upheaval that was all too common for royal women of her time. When she was just 8 years old, she was sent to Germany to be married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. This was a political alliance, pure and simple, a way for her father to secure a powerful ally on the continent. For young Matilda, it meant being torn away from all that was familiar and thrust into a foreign court where she knew neither the language nor the customs. One can only imagine the fear and loneliness she must have felt as she sailed across the sea to her new home, her fate sealed by the machinations of men she barely knew. As Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda was expected to play the role of dutiful wife and queen. She was known for her piety and her patronage of religious houses, virtues that were highly prized in a medieval consort. But Matilda's life was not to be a quiet one of domestic contentment. In 1125, Emperor Henry V died suddenly, leaving Matilda a widow at the age of just 23. And so, she found herself once again at the centre of a political maelstrom. With no male heirs to inherit the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda was forced to fight for her rights as a ruler in her own name. She returned to England, where her father named her his heir presumptive, a move that was virtually unprecedented in a time when the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable. But Matilda's claim to the throne was far from secure. When Henry I died in 1135, the stage was set for a showdown between Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois, who had seized the throne in her absence. What followed was a period of chaos and civil war known as the Anarchy, as Matilda and Stephen battled for supremacy. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart by conflict, as the two claimants to the throne and their supporters clashed in a series of bloody battles and sieges. Throughout it all, Matilda displayed a tenacity and force of will that was remarkable for a woman of her time. She personally led armies into battle, endured harrowing sieges, and narrowly escaped capture on more than one occasion. In 1141, she came tantalizingly close to securing the throne, even holding court in London as Lady of the English. But the tides of war and the prejudices of men were ultimately too much to overcome. In the end, it was Matilda's son, Henry II, who would go on to rule England, founding the great Plantagenet dynasty. But Matilda's legacy lived on, not just in her progeny, but in the very idea that a woman could aspire to rule in her own right. Her story is a testament to the indomitable spirit of medieval royal women, who often faced unimaginable adversity and yet somehow found the strength to persevere. In a time when women were often seen as little more than property to be traded and bargained with, Matilda dared to fight for her place in history. As we continue our journey through the lives of medieval queens and princesses, we'll encounter many more stories of resilience and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. From Eleanor of Aquitaine to Isabella of France, these women navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with skill and determination. But for now, dear listener, let us pause and reflect on the life of Matilda, a woman who defied the conventions of her time and left an indelible mark on the pages of history. As you drift off to sleep, picture her riding at the head of her army, her banner snapping in the wind, her eyes fixed on the horizon and the crown that was her birthright. In our next chapter, we'll explore the fate of royal women who were sent far from home to serve as political pawns in the great game of medieval diplomacy. Imagine being a young princess, barely in your teens, dispatched to a foreign land to marry a man you've never met, all for the sake of a political alliance. This was the fate of countless royal women in the Middle Ages who often found themselves at the mercy of the men who governed their lives. From Eleanor of Aquitaine to Marguerite of Provence, we'll meet queens who endured loveless marriages, dangerous intrigues, and the constant threat of exile or imprisonment. But for now, let the tale of Matilda's valour and determination be the last image in your mind as you slip into a restful slumber. Her story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience and strength. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. When next we meet, we'll continue our exploration of the lives of medieval royal women, lives marked by duty, danger, and the eternal struggle for power and survival in a world dominated by men. As we've seen, medieval queens and princesses faced the ever-present spectre of childbirth, a perilous and often deadly ordeal in an age before modern medicine. One such tragic tale is that of Anne Neville, wife to King Richard III and Queen of England for just over a year. Born into the influential Neville family, Anne was no stranger to the twists and turns of fortune that characterized the lives of medieval noblewomen. Her father, known as Warwick the Kingmaker, was instrumental in deposing King Henry VI and installing Edward IV on the throne. But when Warwick later turned against Edward, Anne found herself caught in the middle of a bloody civil conflict. Married at just 14 to Edward, Prince of Wales, in a political alliance, Anne became Princess of Wales. But her young husband was killed in battle just months later. Widowed and taken prisoner, Anne's future was thrust into uncertainty. In a twist of fate, she would soon marry Richard, Duke of Gloucester, her late husband's rival, and the future Richard III. When Richard took the throne in 1483, Anne was crowned his queen consort in a lavish ceremony, but her tenure as queen would be heartbreakingly brief. Just a year later, Anne faced the devastating loss of her only child, 10-year-old Edward of Middleham. The prince's death left Richard without an heir, and by all accounts, Anne was shattered by the loss. Compounding this tragedy, Anne's own health soon took a turn for the worse. By March of 1485, the 28-year-old queen was dead, possibly of tuberculosis, or as some whispered, of a broken heart. Her life and tragic end exemplify the precarious position of even the most highborn of medieval women, forever at the mercy of political machinations and the cruel whims of fate. Worn down by grief and illness, Anne Neville was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the same hallowed ground where she had so recently been crowned. The grandeur of her funeral only underscored the fleeting nature of her glory. In just a few short months, her husband too would be dead, slain in battle by Henry Tudor. And so, the wheel of fortune turned once more, ushering in a new dynasty and consigning Anne to the shadows of history. But while Anne Neville's life was cut tragically short, other medieval queens managed to carve out a lasting legacy through their piety and patronage. In an era when a woman's role was tightly circumscribed, acts of religious devotion and cultural sponsorship provided an acceptable outlet for their wealth and influence. One such patron was Philippa of Hainault, Queen of England, as the wife of King Edward III. Philippa is often overshadowed by her formidable mother-in-law, Isabella of France, whom we'll come to later. But in her own quiet way, Philippa left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of 14th century England. Born into the French-speaking nobility of Hainault, now part of Belgium, Philippa was married to Edward in a diplomatic alliance at the tender age of 13. Coming to a foreign land and navigating the complex web of English court politics couldn't have been easy for the young princess. But by all accounts, Philippa rose to the challenge with grace and fortitude. As queen, Philippa became known for her piety and generosity. She was a frequent benefactor of religious houses, donating jewels and rich gifts to her favoured establishments. But perhaps her most enduring legacy was her patronage of Queen's College, Oxford. Founded in 1341 at Philippa's urging, Queen's College was innovative in its mission to provide education to students from her native Hainaut. At a time when university education was largely the preserve of the English elite, this was a groundbreaking move. Philippa's influence also shaped the college aesthetically. The magnificent Queen's College Chapel, with its soaring windows and vaulted ceiling, was built under her sponsorship. Philippa's patronage extended beyond the religious and into the literary sphere. She was a key supporter of Jean Froissart, one of the most notable chroniclers of the 14th century. Under her patronage, Froissart began his famous chronicles, a vivid, if not always impartial account of the 100 Years' War between England and France. Philippa's story reminds us that while medieval queens were often consigned to the sidelines of power, they could still wield significant influence through their cultural and religious patronage. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, the language of art, architecture, and pious works allowed them to leave their mark on history. But for all the solace that religion and patronage could provide, the fact remained that a medieval queen's life was ultimately subject to the whims of men. And when political winds shifted, even the most influential of women could find themselves cast out into the cold. Such was the fate of Marguerite of Provence, Queen of France, as the wife of Louis IX. Marguerite's story takes us from the heights of influence to the depths of despair, painting a vivid picture of the precarity of a medieval queen's position. Born into the nobility of Provence, Marguerite was renowned for her beauty and intellect. Married to Louis at the age of just 13, she initially enjoyed a position of great influence at the French court. The young king was evidently enamored with his bride, and Marguerite used her sway to promote the interests of her Provençal relatives and allies. But Marguerite's power soon drew the ire of the French nobility, who resented the influence of these foreign interlopers. Whispers began to circulate of Marguerite's alleged infidelity, casting aspersions on the paternity of her children. While these rumours were likely baseless, they underscored the precarious nature of a queen's reputation in the royal fishbowl. Marguerite's fortunes took a further turn when Louis embarked on the Seventh Crusade in 1248. With the king away waging holy war, the nobility took the opportunity to move against Marguerite and her faction. The Queen Mother, Blanche of Castile, used her own considerable influence to sideline Marguerite and reassert control over the Regency government. Stripped of her power and position, Marguerite took the desperate step of setting out to join her husband on crusade. It was a perilous journey for a woman to undertake, fraught with the dangers of sea travel and the machinations of hostile forces. But for Marguerite, it seemed the only way to escape the indignities being heaped upon her in France. In a cruel twist of fate, however, Marguerite would find little respite in the Holy Land. Louis had been captured by Egyptian forces, and Marguerite arrived to find herself effectively a prisoner in a foreign land. According to contemporary accounts, she gave birth to their son in the most harrowing of circumstances, surrounded by the constant threat of violence. Marguerite's ordeal exemplifies the knife edge upon which a medieval queen's fate balanced. From the heights of influence to the depths of despair, her story swung on the caprice of men and the shifting sands of political fortune. Hers was a life lived in the shadow of power, ever contingent, ever precarious. Eventually, Marguerite and Louis would return to France, the crusade having ended in disaster. The king was a changed man, his fervour for holy war tempered by the brutal realities of the battlefield. As for Marguerite, she retreated increasingly into piety and acts of charity, perhaps seeking solace in the certainties of faith. When Louis set off on yet another ill-fated crusade in 1270, Marguerite was left behind to act as regent alongside their son. It was a poignant coda to a life marked by so many twists and turns of fate. Marguerite would outlive her husband by nearly 3 decades, bearing witness to the reigns of her son and grandson. In the end, Marguerite of Provence's story encapsulates so many of the themes we've explored in the lives of medieval queens. From the heights of power to the depths of despair, hers was a life buffeted by the winds of political fortune. Yet through it all, she endured, a testament to the resilience and fortitude of the women who so often bore the brunt of medieval power politics. But of course, not all medieval queens were content to remain in the shadows. Some, through sheer force of will and personality, managed to carve out a sphere of real influence and power. One of the most notorious examples of this is Isabella of France, the so-called she-wolf who deposed her own husband, King Edward II of England. Isabella's story reads like something out of a dark fairy tale, a tale of love, betrayal, and ultimately revenge. Born into the French royal family, Isabella was married off to Edward II at the tender age of 12 as part of a diplomatic alliance. But from the start, the marriage was fraught with tension and mistrust. Edward, by all accounts, was a weak and ineffectual king, more interested in his male favourites than in the business of ruling. Chief among these favourites was Piers Gaveston, a charismatic Gascon knight who had an almost hypnotic hold over the young king. Edward's obsession with Gaveston and his willingness to shower him with titles and riches soon aroused the ire of the English nobility. For Isabella, Gaveston's influence over her husband must have been a constant source of humiliation and frustration. She was effectively sidelined in her own marriage, her status as queen eclipsed by that of a low-born knight. But Isabella was no shrinking violet. She bided her time, building alliances and cultivating her own power base. The tipping point came in 1325, when Edward sent Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission. It was a decision he would come to regret. In France, Isabella found a powerful ally in the form of Roger Mortimer, a disgruntled English nobleman who had been exiled by Edward. Together, they hatched a daring plan to depose the king and install Isabella's son, the future Edward III, on the throne. What followed was a stunning coup that would change the course of English history. With Mortimer by her side and an army at her back, Isabella landed on the English coast in 1326. The pair quickly gained support from disaffected nobles and marched on London, gathering momentum as they went. Faced with this overwhelming show of force, Edward II had little choice but to flee. He was eventually captured and imprisoned, his fate sealed by the very same nobles who had once supported him. In a chilling act of vengeance, Isabella had her husband brutally murdered, a deed that would earn her the moniker of she-wolf in the annals of history. For a time, Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled England as co-regents, their power unchecked by any higher authority. It was a remarkable inversion of the traditional gender roles of medieval society, a woman wielding the reins of power, with a man as her consort and enforcer. But as with all tales of power and ambition, Isabella's story did not have a happy ending. Her son, Edward III, chafed under the yoke of Mortimer's influence and eventually staged his own coup, having his mother's lover arrested and executed. Isabella herself was spared, but spent the rest of her life in luxurious exile, stripped of her power and influence. In the end, Isabella of France's story stands as a testament to the extraordinary lengths to which a medieval queen might go to assert her own agency in a world dominated by men. Through sheer force of will and personality, she upended the established order, seizing power in a way that few women of her time could have dreamed of. But her tale also serves as a cautionary one, a reminder of the perils that awaited even the most formidable of women in the cutthroat world of medieval politics. For in the end, Isabella's grasp on power was always tenuous, dependent on the whims of the men around her. When those whims shifted, as they inevitably did, she found herself cast aside, a victim of the very same forces she had once sought to control. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of these remarkable women, it's worth reflecting on the harsh realities they faced. To be a queen in the Middle Ages was to walk a constant tightrope, balanced precariously between power and peril. On the one hand, these women enjoyed a level of privilege and influence that was unimaginable to most of their contemporaries. They had access to wealth, education, and cultural resources that set them apart from the vast majority of medieval society. Some, like Philippa of Hainault, used this privilege to leave a lasting mark on the world through acts of patronage and piety. But on the other hand, these women were also acutely vulnerable, their fates tied to the shifting winds of dynastic politics and the whims of the men around them. They faced constant threats to their safety and well-being, from the perils of childbirth to the machinations of rivals and enemies. Some, like Neville, met with tragedy and heartbreak, their lives cut short by the cruel twists of fate. And even those who managed to carve out a sphere of influence, like Isabella of France, did so at great personal risk. In a world where power was the ultimate prize, a woman who dared to reach for it could just as easily find herself cast down into the abyss. Perhaps what's most striking about these stories is the sheer resilience and fortitude of the women who lived them. In the face of unimaginable adversity, they found ways to endure, to adapt, and even to thrive. Whether through acts of piety, patronage, or sheer political maneuvering, they asserted their agency in a world that sought to deny it to them at every turn. In the end, their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting of obstacles. They may have lived in a world far removed from our own, but the challenges they faced, of love and loss, of power and peril, are ones that still resonate across the centuries. So, as we close the book on this chapter of history, let us remember these women, not just as queens and consorts, but as individuals, each with her own unique story to tell. In doing so, we honor their memory and the enduring legacy they left behind. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the lives of medieval queens. I hope that, in some small way, their stories have shed light on the complex realities of life in the Middle Ages, a world of grandeur and squalor, of piety and violence, of love and loss. But more than that, I hope they've served as a reminder of the extraordinary resilience and strength of the human spirit. These women, for all the challenges they faced, found ways to leave their mark on history through their patronage, their piety, and their sheer force of will. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry their stories with us, a testament to the enduring power of the human experience across time and across cultures. And let us remember that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of light to be found, a flicker of hope that can guide us through to brighter days ahead. Good night and sweet dreams. As we've seen, medieval queens and princesses often found their lives shaped by forces far beyond their control, married off to secure alliances, sent to foreign courts, and pressured to produce male heirs. But perhaps no aspect of their lives was more harrowing and dangerous than the perils of childbirth. In an age long before modern medicine, obstetrical care was rudimentary at best. Midwives who attended most births relied more on folklore and tradition than scientific knowledge. The concept of hygiene was poorly understood. Labour took place in dark, stuffy chambers, on beds soiled with the bodily fluids of previous births. Instruments, when used, were not properly cleaned. It's hardly surprising that puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infections, was rampant. For a queen, the risks were compounded by the immense pressure to deliver a healthy son. The succession of a dynasty, the stability of a kingdom, could hinge on the sex of a newborn. Imagine labouring for hours or days in excruciating pain, fearing not only for your own life, but also the political fallout if you failed to produce an heir. The tragic story of Anne Neville, wife of King Richard III, illustrates just how dangerous childbirth could be, even for those at the very pinnacle of society. At just 16, Anne became Queen of England when her husband seized the throne. An intelligent and influential woman, she gave birth to the couple's only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, around 1476. But only a decade later, both Anne and her young son fell gravely ill, likely from tuberculosis. Despite her elevated status, there was little doctors could do. In a matter of months, Anne watched helplessly as her son wasted away and died. Her own health broken, she lived only a few months more before succumbing herself at Westminster Palace in March 1485. She was just 28 years old. Anne's heartbreaking tale was all too common in an era when medicine was powerless against so many ills. For every queen who successfully navigated the perils of childbirth, dozens did not. It's a stark reminder of just how fragile life could be, even for those born to privilege and power. Of course, some royal women did manage to wield influence and authority despite the constraints placed upon them, but to do so often required extraordinary strength of will and personality. They had to navigate not only the dangers of the birthing bed, but the cutthroat intrigues of court politics as well. One such formidable figure was Philippa of Hainault, Queen of England, as the wife of King Edward III. Married at just 13, Philippa quickly demonstrated her intelligence and political acumen. She deftly managed the royal household and served as an important advisor to her husband. But Philippa's most enduring impact may have been as a patron of the arts and scholarship. She sponsored writers like Jean Froissart and provided pensions for scholars at Oxford University. The Queen's College at Oxford, founded in 1341, still bears her name today. In an age when women were largely excluded from formal education, Philippa helped foster a flourishing of learning and culture. Her story hints at the ways some exceptional women were able to shape their own destinies, even within the rigid constraints of medieval queenship. They may have been political pawns, but they weren't always passive ones. Still, for the vast majority of royal women, the realities of their lives were harsher and more circumscribed. Even queens who enjoyed relatively stable and successful marriages could find themselves facing the precariousness of their position if their husband died. Without a male protector, a widowed queen could quickly become vulnerable to the machinations of ambitious nobles or the hostility of a new king. Some sought safety by retiring to a convent. Others threw themselves on the mercy of their relatives. A lucky few were able to carve out a role for themselves as dowager queens, using their wisdom and experience to advise the new ruler. But even this was a tenuous existence, always at the pleasure of the reigning monarch. For a particularly vivid illustration, we need look no further than the story of Marguerite of Provence, wife of Louis IX of France. A savvy and strong-willed woman, Marguerite wielded considerable influence over her husband and served as regent in his absence. But when Louis died in 1270, Marguerite's fortunes quickly changed. Her son, now King Philip III, was estranged from her and resentful of her influence. Facing increasing hostility at court, Marguerite went on pilgrimage, traveling to the Holy Land in the hopes of securing allies and support. But the new king outmaneuvered her, intercepting her letters and turning her own household against her. Increasingly isolated, Marguerite eventually went into exile in Provence, living out her remaining years far from the centers of power she had once controlled. Hers is a stark illustration of just how quickly a queen's fortunes could change. No matter how powerful or influential she might be during her husband's reign, a royal widow could find herself cast aside, marginalized, or even persecuted once a new king took the throne. The chessboard of medieval politics was forever in flux, with queens as vulnerable as any other piece. Of course, not every queen went quietly into exile or retirement. Some, like the infamous Isabella of France, fought back against the powerlessness of their position with shocking force and tenacity. Married to Edward II of England, Isabella chafed at her husband's neglect and the undue influence of his male favourites at court. In 1325, she returned to her native France, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty. But once there, Isabella set about plotting an invasion to depose her own husband. With the help of her lover, Roger Mortimer, she raised an army and sailed for England, landing in 1326. The country quickly rallied to her cause, and Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate in favour of his young son. Isabella now ruled as regent in all but name. It was a stunning reversal, a woman overthrowing the rightful king. But Isabella's bold gambit illustrates just how high the stakes could be for medieval queens. Deprived of official power, they could still find ways to exert their will, even if it meant resorting to violence and intrigue. Isabella's story is a vivid reminder that while royal women were often pawns, they weren't always passive ones. Through cunning, determination, and sheer force of will, a few managed to upset the chessboard and seize some measure of control over their own fates. But such dramatic coups were the exception rather than the rule. For most medieval queens and princesses, life was a constant negotiation of the limits placed upon them by a deeply patriarchal society. Valued mainly for their wombs, they faced immense pressure to produce male heirs. Subject to the whims of fathers, husbands, and sons, their lives were forever precarious. Some found a measure of autonomy through religious devotion or patronage of the arts. Others forged alliances and exerted soft power behind the scenes. A tenacious few even managed to rule as regents or wield overt political influence. But none could fully escape the brutal realities of their position. In a world where power was the preserve of men, royal women faced a constant struggle to shape their own destinies. The perils of childbirth, the capriciousness of dynastic politics, the looming threat of marginalization or exile. These were the inescapable conditions of their lives. And so we return to that draughty castle chamber, to the exhausted figure of the medieval queen, surveying her cramped world of tapestries and smoky fires. She may live amidst grandeur, clad in silks and jewels, and waited on by a vast retinue. But she knows her true worth is measured only in the sons she can produce. Her power, her very survival, is always contingent. It's a grim portrait, a sobering antidote to our romantic notions of medieval royalty, but it's also a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of the women who endured these hardships. Deprived of autonomy, beset by dangers, they nevertheless found ways to leave their mark on history. In their stories, in the triumphs and tragedies, the acts of piety and patronage and intrigue, we catch a glimpse of lives lived under extraordinary pressure, and we're reminded that even in the most constrained of circumstances, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity for endurance and even defiance. So let us spare a thought for Matilda and Eleanor, for Anne and Philippa, and Marguerite and Isabella, and for the countless anonymous royal women whose names are lost to history. Theirs was a brutal and often thankless existence, but one that nevertheless shaped the course of nations and dynasties. In remembering their struggles, we honour their grit and tenacity in the face of overwhelming odds. As the candles flickered in the draughty bedchamber, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, Marguerite of Provence clutched her rosary beads and uttered a fervent prayer. She was about to embark on a perilous journey, a pilgrimage that would take her far from the relative safety and comfort of the royal court. In the 13th century, embarking on a religious pilgrimage was one of the few occasions when a queen might undertake extensive travel. The church heartily approved of these acts of public piety by royal women. Marguerite, wife of the celebrated French King Louis IX, had vowed to make a pilgrimage to the Abbey of Cluny if her husband safely returned from the Seventh Crusade. When Louis finally arrived back on French soil after 6 long years away, Marguerite immediately set about fulfilling her promise to God. She would journey from Paris to the renowned abbey in Burgundy, a voyage of nearly 200 miles, an immense distance in an age when most people rarely ventured more than a few miles from their birthplace. For a queen to undertake such a long, arduous journey was no small matter. The roads were perilous, often little more than muddy, rutted tracks that wound through dense forests and over steep hills. Brigands and highwaymen posed a constant threat to travellers. Moreover, a royal entourage required vast amounts of provisions, not to mention costly gifts to present at the holy sites along the way. Marguerite would have ridden on horseback or in an uncomfortable jostling carriage. Foul weather could easily turn the roads to impassable quagmires. As challenging as the physical journey was, however, it paled in comparison to the political perils faced by a queen who left the side of her king for an extended period. Marguerite's very absence from court created a dangerous vacuum that rival factions sought to fill. Courtiers whispered and schemed, always alert for any shift in the balance of power. A queen's hold on influence was ever tenuous in a world where power flowed from proximity to the monarch. For Marguerite, undertaking her sacred pilgrimage meant relinquishing her hard-won role as Louis's most trusted confidant and advisor. Despite the risks, Marguerite was determined to fulfill her holy vow. With a small retinue of ladies-in-waiting, clerics, and men-at-arms, the Queen set forth from Paris, the bells of Notre Dame Cathedral tolling solemnly behind her. The journey to Cluny would prove long and trying, the roads every bit as treacherous as feared. But for Marguerite, the arduous pilgrimage offered a rare chance to break free from the stifling confines and intrigues of court life, if only for a time. As she rode slowly onward, the Queen's thoughts surely drifted to the holy relics and sites that awaited her. Marguerite looked forward to spending time in tranquil prayer and contemplation within the hushed cloisters of Cluny Abbey. There, in the presence of sacred relics like the purported fingerbone of St. John the Baptist, she would beseech the Almighty for blessings and protection for her husband, her children, and the Kingdom of France. The pilgrimage to Cluny was not to be Marguerite's only foray into the uncertain world beyond castle walls, however. Years later, the Queen would find herself journeying not on a sacred pilgrimage, but into exile. When Marguerite's eldest son, Philip, assumed the throne following his father's death, he swiftly set about marginalizing his strong-willed mother's influence. Resentful of the Queen's meddling and iron control over the royal treasury, Philip had his mother banished from court. Marguerite took up residence at Reims, the site of French coronations. There, as if in defiance of her relegation to the political sidelines, the Queen established her own rival court of sorts. She drew loyal courtiers and dignitaries into her orbit, dispensing patronage and charity. Despite her son's efforts to sideline her, Marguerite refused to relinquish the power and prestige she had grown accustomed to as Queen of France. Even in exile, the indomitable Queen continued to wield influence from afar. Through letters and envoys, she made her displeasure with Philip's policies and appointments known. The new king quickly learned that banishment alone was not enough to silence a woman as savvy and tenacious as Marguerite of Provence. Her decades at the very heart of the royal court had taught the Queen how to navigate the treacherous currents of power. As such, Marguerite's story vividly illustrates the tenuous position of even the most exalted women in medieval society. For a queen, especially one known for her ambition and political acumen, the threat of exile was ever present. A queen served at the pleasure of the king. If she overstepped or displeased him, she could quickly find herself cast out from the royal presence, stripped of power and influence. Yet exile, like pilgrimage, also offered royal women a degree of autonomy and agency seldom possible within the strictures of court life. Removed from the watchful eye of the monarch, an exiled queen could more freely cultivate her own base of support and influence. Indeed, Marguerite of Provence remained a force to be reckoned with, even from her banishment at Reims. The experiences of Marguerite and so many of her royal sisters highlight the peculiar paradox faced by medieval queens. Their lofty status afforded them immense privilege, wealth, and access to power. Yet that same exalted rank also left them intensely vulnerable to the whims and suspicions of their husbands and sons. A queen, even one who wore a crown and sat a throne, was still ultimately subject to male authority. Undertaking a pilgrimage or facing exile were two sides of the same coin for women like Marguerite. Occasions when the normal strictures and scrutiny of their lives eased, if only fleetingly. In those rare moments of relative freedom and autonomy, some royal women found opportunities to more fully become themselves, to wield power and influence on their own terms. The road could be fraught with peril, whether travelling to a holy shrine or banished from court, but it offered tantalizing glimpses of a life less circumscribed by the demands of others. For the indefatigable Marguerite of Provence, neither pilgrimage nor exile could long keep her from the heart of power. This queen understood better than most how to navigate the treacherous landscape of medieval politics. Her years of devotion and service to Louis IX had earned her a reputation as a woman of great piety and wisdom, a formidable figure who commanded respect and allegiance. Even when temporarily removed from the king's side, Marguerite refused to relinquish her hard-won authority. As she made her arduous way toward Cluny Abbey all those years ago, rosary beads clasped tightly in her hands, Marguerite surely drew strength and resolve from her faith. In a world where the winds of power and peril could shift without warning, the queen had learned to rely on her own unshakable sense of purpose. Come what may, pilgrimage or exile, power or persecution, Marguerite of Provence would remain steadfast. For this redoubtable medieval queen, adversity was simply another challenge to be met with the same unwavering resilience that had defined her remarkable life. The life of a medieval queen was a paradoxical one. To the common folk, these royal women lived in unimaginable grandeur, with every comfort provided. But behind the castle walls lay a harsh and precarious existence, where even the most blue-blooded ladies were not immune from the era's many perils. Power was a double-edged sword. It provided prestige, but also painted a target on one's back in a world where fortunes could change at the drop of a hat. Perhaps no one embodied these contradictions more than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into nobility as the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, she was renowned across Europe for her beauty, intelligence, and sizable inheritance. These qualities made Eleanor a much sought-after bride, and at just 15 years old, she was married off to King Louis VII of France in 1137. While such an illustrious match might seem like a fairy tale ending, the reality was far from idyllic. Eleanor chafed at the restrictions placed on her by the pious and austere French court. The king was more interested in religious devotion than romantic love, and the couple became increasingly estranged. During their marriage, Eleanor accompanied Louis on the ill-fated Second Crusade to the Holy Land, an arduous journey for even the hardiest of men, let alone a young queen. The expedition was a failure on many fronts, and rumour swirled that Eleanor had engaged in an affair with her uncle Raymond while in Antioch. Although never proven, the scandal further strained her relationship with Louis. Upon their return, the couple soon sought an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, as they were in fact distant cousins. The convenient discovery of this blood tie provided a face-saving way to end their unhappy union. At age 30, Eleanor once again found herself a pawn on the marriage market, albeit an extremely valuable one. Her vast lands made her an attractive prospect for many powerful suitors. Just 2 months after her annulment, she hastily wed the young Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou. It was a defiant match that shocked many, as Henry was the rival and enemy of her former husband Louis. This second marriage proved more passionate, but no less tumultuous. Henry and Eleanor had a fiery dynamic, clashing often as two strong personalities both accustomed to having their way. When Henry ascended to the English throne in 1154, Eleanor was crowned Queen of England. Over the next 13 years, she bore Henry 8 children, including 5 sons, finally achieving the critical duty of providing male heirs. But Eleanor was no passive consort content to stay quietly in the background. She continued to be actively involved in governance, often serving as regent in Henry's absence. Her court at Poitiers became a renowned centre of courtly love and artistry, in contrast to Henry's more rough-and-tumble preferred pastimes like hunting and warfare. As their children grew, family squabbles escalated into outright rebellion, with Eleanor's sons rising up against their father, likely with her tacit support. Incensed by this betrayal, Henry had Eleanor arrested and imprisoned for treason. She spent the next 16 years under house arrest, largely confined to various royal holdings. It was only after Henry's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally freed by her son, and now King Richard the Lionheart. In a remarkable turn of events, the nearly 70-year-old Eleanor stepped back into the spheres of power as she took on the role of regent while Richard launched his crusade. Even in her advanced age, the indomitable queen travelled across Europe to negotiate Richard's marriage and ransom when he was captured. Eleanor's later years serving as an elder stateswoman marked a triumphant final chapter in a turbulent life that saw dramatic swings of fortune. Her story embodied the dizzying heights and plummeting depths that defined the capricious lives of even the most elite medieval women. From glittering courts to dank prison cells, the ever-present spectres of dynastic manoeuvring, forbidden love, and shifting allegiances meant that no queen, however powerful, was ever truly secure. Indeed, if the trials of Eleanor of Aquitaine demonstrated anything, it was that the glittering trappings of royal power were underpinned by the cold, hard realities of medieval marriage and motherhood. For even the highest-born women of the time, their chief value lay in their wombs and the sons they could produce to carry on family lines. This unrelenting pressure shadowed queens from the moment they took their marital vows. Childbirth in the medieval era was an incredibly perilous undertaking for women of all stations. But for royal women, the stakes were amplified by the added political implications. A queen's fertility was a matter of dynastic urgency, with the succession and stability of entire kingdoms often hinging on her ability to bear healthy sons. Yet the state of medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was woefully inadequate to ensure safe deliveries. Childbirth was an agonizing and life-threatening ordeal, with queens confined to dark, airless chambers for the final weeks of pregnancy to protect the baby from evil spirits. They were attended by midwives of varying skill who relied on a combination of folk wisdom, prayer, and dubious concoctions to ease labor pains. Hygiene was rudimentary at best, with chambers strewn with rushes to soak up the copious blood and fluids of delivery. It's estimated that about 5% of births ended in the mother's death, most commonly from infection. For royals, the rate was likely even higher given the frequency with which queens found themselves pregnant. Anne Neville, the wife of King Richard III of England, endured a particularly heart-wrenching reproductive struggle. Married at just 16 years old in 1472, Anne faced immense pressure to produce an heir for the House of York. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, a devastating but all too common outcome. In 1473, Anne finally gave birth to a son, Edward of Middleham. The kingdom rejoiced at the arrival of a male heir to cement the York claim to the throne. But just 2 years later, tragedy struck when the little prince fell ill and passed away suddenly. Anne was understandably grief-stricken at the loss of her only child. Worse still, Anne herself had emerged from the birthing bed changed. Once described as a great beauty, her health was now shattered, possibly from a difficult delivery or postpartum infection. She became increasingly frail and withdrawn, a shadow of her former vibrant self. As one chronicler noted, she was wasted with sorrow. Despite her fragile condition, Anne conceived again in late 1484. It was to be her final pregnancy, as she died in March of 1485, at the age of just 28. The cause was likely related to the cumulative physical strains of childbearing, exacerbated by her general ill health. Richard III was shattered by his beloved queen's passing, and just 5 months later, he too met his end at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Anne Neville's poignant tale highlights the unforgiving physical toll that reproduction exacted on the bodies of medieval royal women. Regarded as little more than vessels for carrying on dynasties, queens were afforded precious little rest between pregnancies to recover, placing enormous strain on their health. The pressure to keep producing heirs was unrelenting, even in the face of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant mortality. This cycle of childbearing was also deeply entwined with the political maneuvering that dominated court life. A queen's status often directly correlated to her reproductive success, with her influence and security rising and falling with the births and deaths of children, particularly sons. Failure to conceive was viewed as a personal and moral failing, rather than a twist of biological fate. Beyond the bedchamber, medieval queens were expected to be paragons of piety and virtue, setting an example of religious devotion for their subjects to follow. The ideal queen was meant to be a helpmate to her husband, an obedient consort who deferred to his authority. In reality, this submissive veneer often concealed a cannier political instinct, with savvy queens finding ways to exercise influence informally. One common avenue for queens to flex their patronage muscle was through sponsoring religious institutions and causes. Founding abbeys, almshouses, and hospitals was a way to publicly display one's magnanimity and godliness, while also creating a network of loyal clerics and retainers. These acts of conspicuous piety served to counter the frequent whispers about queens' lasciviousness and meddling that swirled around court. Philippa of Hainault, the wife of King Edward III of England, skillfully navigated these expectations during her 3 decades as queen. Revered for her compassion and generosity, she endowed Queen's College at Oxford University, with the aim of providing education to poor students. She was also a keen patron of the arts, employing minstrels and poets to entertain at her lively court. But perhaps Philippa's most enduring legacy was her influence on the next generation of Plantagenets. She served as a trusted advisor to her eldest son Edward, the famed Black Prince, cultivating his leadership abilities and chivalric ideals. When the king descended into dotage, it was Philippa who helped manage the transition of power to their capable heir. As mother to an impressive brood of 12 children who survived to adulthood, Philippa had fulfilled her duty and then some to propagate the Plantagenet line. Her fecundity combined with her gracious but steely disposition made her a formidable queen who commanded genuine respect rather than grudging obeisance. When she passed away in 1369, she was deeply mourned by the king and kingdom alike. In many ways, Philippa of Hainault represented the medieval queenly ideal, a fertile, decorous consort who provided wise counsel, while largely remaining in the background. But this paradigm was not one that all royal women could or would conform to. In a world where the boundaries between the personal and political were gossamer thin, some queens could not resist the temptation to test the limits of their feminine authority. Perhaps no medieval queen pushed the envelope further than Isabella of France. The only surviving daughter of King Philip IV of France, Isabella was married off to King Edward II of England in 1308 at the tender age of 12. It was a classic diplomatic alliance, meant to ease tensions between the two kingdoms. But the marriage soon soured as Edward's blatant favoritism toward his male courtiers, particularly Hugh Despenser the Younger, alienated Isabella. By 1325, the estrangement between the royal couple had reached a breaking point. Using the excuse of negotiating a peace treaty with France, Isabella decamped to Paris and refused to return to England as long as the Despensers remained at court. From exile, she began plotting to overthrow her husband with the help of her lover, Roger Mortimer. In a stunning reversal of gender roles, Isabella raised a mercenary army and invaded England in 1326, rallying disaffected nobles to her cause. Deserted by his followers and captured by Isabella's forces, Edward II was forced to abdicate in favour of their teenage son, who became King Edward III. Although Isabella claimed to be acting as regent for her son, it soon became clear that she and Mortimer were the true power behind the throne. For 4 years, the pair ruled England in all but name, using their position to enrich themselves and dispatch their enemies. It was an astonishing turn of events in an era where women, let alone queens, were expected to be submissive and apolitical. Isabella's brazen actions earned her the moniker, the She-Wolf of France, for her ruthless pursuit of power. But Isabella's gambit was a step too far for the English nobility, who chafed at being ruled by an adulterous foreign-born queen and her upstart lover. In 1330, the young King Edward III asserted his authority by staging a palace coup, arresting Mortimer and having him executed for treason. As for Isabella, she was effectively banished from court, forced to live out her remaining years in obscurity at a remote castle. Isabella of France's dramatic rise and fall embodied the knife's edge that medieval queens had to walk. Operating in the shadowlands between explicit and implicit power, they had to tread carefully in asserting their influence. A misstep could mean disgrace, exile, or even death in an unforgiving political landscape. For while queenship conferred great privilege and prestige, it also entailed profound vulnerability and precarity. Royal women were always just one false move, one dry womb, one rogue rumour away from disaster. In a world where dynastic ambition trumped all, queens were often little more than pawns to be traded, tolerated and tossed aside in the great game of statecraft. This reality was perhaps most viscerally reflected in the perils of pilgrimage and exile that loomed over many medieval queens. In an era of performative piety, going on pilgrimage was one of the few acceptable reasons for royal women to venture beyond their domestic sphere. These journeys offered a rare taste of adventure and autonomy, a chance to escape the suffocating confines of the court. But pilgrimage was also an immensely arduous and hazardous undertaking in the medieval era. Travel was slow and uncomfortable, along rutted roads and stormy seas. Bandits and disease posed a constant threat, ready to cut down even the most blue-blooded of wayfarers. Many queens undertook pilgrimages not just for spiritual edification, but for political expediency, either as penance for perceived transgressions or as a show of contrition to ease tensions. For Marguerite of Provence, consort to Louis IX of France, pilgrimage proved to be a source of both solace and sorrow. A deeply devout woman, Marguerite accompanied her equally pious husband on his first crusade to Egypt in 1248. It was a disastrous campaign, culminating in Louis being captured by the Mamluks. Marguerite, who was pregnant at the time, managed to scrape together the enormous ransom to free Louis and his surviving men. But the ordeal left them both physically and mentally scarred, with Louis vowing to launch another crusade to atone for his failure. In 1270, the royal couple set out again, this time for Tunis. But they never reached their destination. Louis died of dysentery along the way, leaving Marguerite devastated. Now a widow, Marguerite returned to France to serve as regent for her young son, but her grip on power was tenuous, and she soon found herself outmaneuvered by her own brother-in-law. In a final indignity, Marguerite was more or less banished from court, forced to retreat to her dower lands in Provence. It was a bitter coda to a life marked by both the lofty heights of queenship and the capricious turns of fortune. Marguerite of Provence's journey encapsulated the dizzying vicissitudes that defined the lives of medieval queens. Theirs was a tightrope existence, forever balanced between the sacral and the strife-filled, the exalted and the insecure. Even the most seemingly stable of royal marriages could not shield them from the ever-present threats of political eclipse, exile, and erasure. For in the final accounting, medieval queens were hostage to both their fickle biology and the implacable forces of dynasty. Their worth was measured in heirs and unction, their persons deployed as diplomatic bargaining chips. They lived under a burden of relentless scrutiny, their every move and utterance dissected for signs of scandal or sedition. And yet, for all the perils and precarity of their position, queens also held a uniquely visible platform from which to influence events. Through the soft power levers of patronage, pilgrimage, and piety, they could carve out spheres of influence that belied their ostensibly subordinate status. Behind the placid mask of queenly composure lay reservoirs of resilience and resourcefulness that sustained them through the many trials of their station. In the tapestry of medieval history, these royal women's stories form a glittering but bloodied thread. Theirs was a sisterhood bound by the common experiences of perilous childbirth, loveless marriage, and capricious fortune. Even the mightiest among them walked a razor's edge, their fates ultimately dependent on the whims of fathers, husbands, and sons. To look back on their lives from the vantage of modernity is to marvel at the sheer fortitude it took to endure in a world so hostile to their agency. For every Eleanor of Aquitaine who managed to claw her way to a modicum of self-determination, there were scores of forgotten queens who languished in obscurity, valued only for their fertility or utility to the dynastic project. Their names may have faded from the historical record, but their collective struggles reverberate across the centuries, a testament to the unyielding and often unsung strength of the medieval female. Theirs was a sisterhood of survival in a world where womanhood itself was a high-wire act, forever poised between the sacred and the profane. In the end, perhaps the greatest legacy left by these long-ago queens is the enduring example of their resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. They navigated the treacherous currents of court life with a grace and grit that belied the gilded cage of their queenship. In doing so, they etched their indelible mark on the annals of history, one defiant breath at a time. The regal beauty and luxurious finery of Isabella of France masked a steely determination and shrewd political mind. Born into the powerful Capetian dynasty of France in 1295, Isabella was dispatched to England at the tender age of 12 to marry the English king, Edward II. It was an arrangement meant to foster peace between the two kingdoms, but it was not a happy union. Edward was an ineffectual ruler with little interest in governance or his young bride. He lavished favour and power on his male favourites, much to the resentment of England's nobles. The spurned Isabella found herself isolated and powerless in a foreign court, her queenly authority eclipsed by the whims of her feckless husband. But Isabella would not resign herself to irrelevance. She bided her time, quietly cultivating allies and waiting for an opportune moment to strike. That moment arrived in 1325, when tensions between England and France flared once again. Edward dispatched Isabella to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV of France. It was a fateful decision. Once safely back in her native France, Isabella unveiled her true intentions. She refused to return to England until Edward expelled his favourites from court. Incensed, Edward refused, but Isabella had a new card to play. She had taken a lover of her own, the dashing English nobleman Roger Mortimer. Together, they hatched an audacious plot to invade England and depose Edward. With her son, the future Edward III, in tow as figurehead, Isabella and Mortimer landed on English shores in 1326 with a small mercenary force. To their shock, support for their cause snowballed with astonishing speed. Disaffected nobles rallied to the rebel queen, and Edward's regime crumbled with barely a fight. The king was forced to abdicate in favour of his young son, with Isabella ruling as regent. At last, the long-overlooked queen had seized the reins of power with her own hands. Edward was imprisoned, then gruesomely executed, allegedly by having a red-hot poker thrust into his bowels. The lurid whispers of his demise only burnished Isabella's formidable reputation. For 4 years, Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled England, enriching themselves and purging the kingdom of their remaining enemies. But their ruthless regime bred resentment, and in 1330, the 18-year-old Edward III asserted his royal authority with a counter-coup. Mortimer was hanged as a traitor, and Isabella was relegated to a quiet retirement on a generous pension. The she-wolf of France, as Isabella was dubbed by her foes, had orchestrated the first successful invasion of England since the Norman conquest 3 centuries prior. Her astonishing trajectory from child bride to rebel queen to deposed regent was a testament to her indomitable will and keen political instincts. In an age where royal women were often regarded as little more than dynastic chess pieces, Isabella boldly rewrote the rules. Through cunning statecraft, brazen adultery, and even outright warfare, she had clawed her way to the apex of power. Though her own reign was fleeting, Isabella's dramatic life served as a powerful reminder. Even in the male-dominated world of medieval monarchy, formidable queens could still upend the political order. As the chaos of Isabella's time receded into memory, England was left to grapple with the unsettling implications of her story. How much power could a queen be allowed to wield? What were the consequences when family ties and feudal obligations collided? These were questions that would echo down through centuries of English history, as new generations of royal women navigated the treacherous currents of court intrigue and dynastic politics. Isabella's own granddaughter, Philippa of Hainault, would go on to become one of medieval England's most influential queen consorts. But Philippa's power was of a decidedly different character than Isabella's had been. Where Isabella had seized the stage through daring and guile, Philippa would work behind the scenes, acting as a trusted advisor to her husband and a generous patron of learning. Born in 1310 or 1311 in the Low Countries of what is now Belgium, Philippa was the daughter of the Count of Hainault. At age 9, she was betrothed to the future Edward III of England, Isabella's son. It was a splendid match, meant to bolster vital trade ties between England and the Low Countries. In 1328, a jubilant Philippa arrived in London for a magnificent royal wedding. By all accounts, the marriage was a success, both politically and personally. The young couple were well suited and grew genuinely fond of each other. When Edward launched his audacious bid to claim the French crown, triggering the 100 Years' War, Philippa accompanied him on campaign, even giving birth to their son in a tent on the battlefield. But it was in the domestic sphere that Philippa truly shone. She served as regent in her husband's absence, managing the kingdom's affairs with wisdom and care. Fluent in several languages, she maintained diplomatic ties across Europe, and she became a celebrated sponsor of the arts, literature, and education. Philippa funded the expansion of the famed colleges of Oxford and Cambridge and supported scholars like Jean Froissart, whose chronicles remain an invaluable window into 14th century life. She was known for her piety and generosity, distributing alms to the poor and founding religious houses like the famous Queen's College, Oxford. Despite bearing at least a dozen children, including another future king, John of Gaunt, Philippa remained a vibrant presence at court into her later years. When Edward III founded the chivalric Order of the Garter, Philippa was appointed its first lady companion, a singular honour. Her death in 1369 was deeply mourned by the king and kingdom alike. The poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who owed his early success to Philippa's patronage, composed verses in her honour, praising her virtue and noble spirit. In Philippa, England had found a queen who perfectly embodied the medieval ideal, gracious and loyal, learned and devout. But even a paragon like Philippa was not immune to the harsh realities facing royal women in the Middle Ages. The hazards of childbirth had shadowed Philippa throughout her marriage. At least 3 of her children had died young. And for all the genuine affection between Philippa and Edward, she had still been a stranger in a strange land, dispatched from one court to another to serve the interests of men. It was a theme that played out again and again in the lives of medieval queens and princesses, whether forging their own paths, like the audacious Isabella, or working within the constraints of their role, like the estimable Philippa. These women walked a perilous tightrope. The splendor of their rank was forever haunted by the specter of personal tragedy and political upheaval. As the Middle Ages wore on, the perils and pressures facing royal women would only grow. The age of chivalry was giving way to the cold calculations of the Renaissance, as a new generation of kings and queens jockeyed for power on an ever more complex European stage. In this treacherous new world, the role of the royal consort would be more fraught than ever. But that, perhaps, is a story for another day. For now, we leave Philippa of Hainaut to her well-deserved rest, and the rebel Queen Isabella to her complicated legacy. 2 very different women, leading 2 very different lives, but both inextricably bound by the demands and limitations placed upon medieval queenship. As we let the mists of time swirl closed around them, we're left to ponder the harsh truths their stories reveal about power, womanhood, and the capricious tides of history. These are questions that transcend any one era, echoing down to us today with undiminished urgency. In the triumphs and tragedies of queens long gone, we may yet find glimmers of our own struggles and aspirations, refracted through the prism of the past. So let us bid good night to Philippa and Isabella, and to all the royal women of the Middle Ages whose lives were so often marked by peril and precarity. May their stories continue to instruct and inspire us, even as we work to build a world where the circumstances of one's birth no longer dictate the shape of one's life. And may we always remember the quiet courage of those who came before, blazing trails through uncharted territory with grace, grit, and unflinching resolve. As the candles gutter and the first fingers of dawn creep across the horizon, we close the chapter on another era, secure in the knowledge that the lessons it holds are not lost to time, but waiting patiently for us to discover anew. Like a loyal chronicler keeping vigil over the ages, history stands ready to illuminate our present and guide our steps into an ever-unfolding future. And so we sleep, perchance to dream, of fair Philippas and fierce Isabellas, and all the untold stories that lie between the lines of the history books. For in the end, it is the human heart that animates the grand tapestry of time. And it is there, in the quiet moments and unsung struggles, that the true essence of our shared past is woven, stitch by precious stitch. As Isabella of France's tumultuous tale reminds us, even the most privileged and powerful women in medieval society walked a precarious tightrope. The glittering crowns and sumptuous gowns concealed a darker reality, one of uncertainty, peril, and too often, tragedy. For our next heroine, we travel to the wind-swept moors of northern England in the year 1349, Amid the looming shadows of Durham Castle, a young royal bride prepares to meet her destiny. She is Joan, the daughter of Edward III, King of England. And at just 13 years of age, she has been promised in marriage to Pedro of Castile, the newly crowned King of Spain. Joan's match with Pedro was a political masterstroke designed to solidify the budding alliance between England and Castile. But for the young princess, it meant bidding farewell to everything she had ever known. Sent across the sea to an unfamiliar land, Joan was expected to navigate the treacherous waters of the Castilian court, all while still a child herself. The early days of Joan's marriage were marked by loneliness and trepidation. Pedro, known to history as the Cruel, was a ruthless and capricious ruler with a penchant for violence. He took little interest in his young bride, preferring the company of his mistress, Maria de Padilla. As the years went by, Joan found herself increasingly isolated and unhappy. She was a stranger in a strange land, far from the comfort and support of her family. Her queenly duties, overseeing the royal household, dispensing patronage, even producing an heir, were made all the more difficult by her husband's indifference and the machinations of the Castilian nobles. Yet, even in the face of such adversity, Joan endured. She cultivated a reputation for piety and charity, winning the affection of the common people. When the plague of the Black Death reached Castile in 1361, Joan worked tirelessly to ease the suffering of her adopted homeland, even as she grieved the loss of her own firstborn child. But Joan's greatest trial was yet to come. In 1366, her husband Pedro was overthrown in a coup led by his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Suddenly, the once powerful Queen of Castile found herself a prisoner, held captive by Henry's forces. For 6 long years, Joan languished in captivity, her fate uncertain. It was only through the tireless efforts of her father Edward III that she was finally released in 1372. Aged 33 and forever altered by her harrowing experience, Joan at last returned to England, the homeland she had left behind so long ago. Joan's tale is a poignant reminder of the powerlessness that even the most high-born women could face in the medieval world. Buffeted by political winds beyond their control, their very survival often hung in the balance. And yet, time and again, these women found reserves of resilience that belied their seemingly fragile existence. Through acts of piety, charity, and sheer force of will, they carved out spheres of influence that transcended the limitations placed upon them. One such figure was Philippa of Hainault, Queen of England and wife of Edward III. Though her marriage, like so many royal unions, was arranged for political gain, Philippa proved herself an able and influential consort. As a patron of the arts, she helped foster a cultural renaissance in the English court. The Queen sponsored minstrels, poets, and scholars, transforming her adopted homeland into a centre of learning and creativity. She even played a key role in the founding of Queen's College at Oxford University, one of the oldest and most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the world. But Philippa's influence extended far beyond the realm of arts and letters. She was a skilled diplomat, often called upon to mediate disputes and broker alliances. When the kingdom faced the ravages of the 100 Years' War, Philippa served as regent in her husband's absence, capably overseeing the governance of the realm. Perhaps most remarkably, Philippa's marriage to Edward III seems to have been a genuinely affectionate partnership. The couple had 12 children together, and by all accounts, the king relied heavily on his queen's counsel and support. When Philippa passed away in 1369, Edward was said to be inconsolable with grief. In many ways, Philippa of Hainault represents the ideal of queenship in the medieval world, a woman who, through her intelligence, grace, and strength of character, transcended the limitations placed upon her gender to become a true partner in governance. But even for a queen as capable as Philippa, life was far from a fairy tale. The spectre of death loomed large over the medieval world, and royal women were not exempt from its grasp. In an age before modern medicine, childbirth was a perilous undertaking, one that claimed the lives of countless women, both common and noble alike. Among the most tragic of these tales is that of Anne Neville, Queen of England, and wife of Richard III. A daughter of the powerful Neville family, Anne was no stranger to the turbulent political landscape of 15th century England. Her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was a key player in the Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil conflict that pitted the houses of Lancaster and York against each other in a battle for the English throne. Like so many medieval women, Anne's fate was inexorably tied to the political fortunes of the men in her life. When her father fell out of favour with the Yorkist king Edward IV, Anne and her sister Isabel were married off to Edward's younger brothers George and Richard in a bid to shore up the fragile peace. But the calm would not last. In 1471, Anne's father and husband were killed in battle against Edward's forces, leaving her a widow at the tender age of 14. Her lands and titles were stripped away, and she was placed in the custody of her brother-in-law, the future Richard III. What followed was a whirlwind courtship that scandalized the English court. Richard, it seems, had fallen deeply in love with his young charge and was determined to make her his queen. In a secret ceremony, the two were wed, much to the dismay of those who saw the match as a blatant power grab. As Queen of England, Anne Neville's life was marked by both triumph and tragedy. She bore Richard a son, Edward, securing the Yorkist dynasty's hold on the throne. But the young prince's life would be cut tragically short, dying at just 10 years of age. Anne herself would not long outlive her son. In March of 1485, after months of illness, the Queen passed away at the age of 28. The cause of her death remains a mystery to this day, with some speculating that she may have succumbed to tuberculosis or even poison. Richard III, the man who had moved heaven and earth to make Anne his bride, was said to be heartbroken by her loss. In a letter written shortly after her death, he described his queen as a good, gracious, and most virtuous lady who lived her life in a very Christian way. But even in death, Anne Neville could not escape the tumult of the times in which she lived. Just 5 months after her passing, Richard himself would be killed in battle at Bosworth Field, bringing an end to the Yorkist dynasty and ushering in the Tudor era. As we come to the close of our journey through the lives of medieval royal women, it is impossible not to be struck by the sheer resilience and fortitude they displayed in the face of unimaginable adversity. From the political machinations of Eleanor of Aquitaine to the piety of Philippa of Hainault, from the tenacity of Matilda of England to the tragedy of Anne Neville, these women navigated a world that was at once glittering and treacherous, where power and peril often went hand in hand. Their stories serve as a poignant reminder that even in the most rarefied echelons of society, medieval women faced challenges and constraints that are almost unimaginable to us today. Traded like chattel to cement political alliances, confined to the roles of wife and mother, and forever at the mercy of the men who controlled their destinies, these women nonetheless found ways to assert their agency and influence the course of history. In founding abbeys and sponsoring the arts, in serving as regents and counsellors to kings, in performing acts of charity and piety that inspired the masses, medieval queens and princesses carved out spheres of influence that transcended the limitations placed upon their gender. Their legacies endure not just in the pages of history books, but in the very fabric of the world we inhabit today. From the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals to the hallowed halls of ancient universities, the imprint of medieval queenship can be seen and felt across the centuries. So the next time you find yourself wandering through a crumbling castle, keep, or admiring a luminous work of medieval art, take a moment to remember the women whose stories are so often left untold. the queens and princesses who, through their courage, resilience, and unwavering spirit, helped shape the course of history. In their tales of triumph and tragedy, of power and peril, we may just find a glimmer of our own struggles and aspirations, reflected back at us across the ages. For in the end, the human experience is one that transcends time and place, connecting us all in a tapestry of shared hopes, dreams, and challenges. And so we come to the end of our journey through the annals of medieval queenship. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry with us the stories of these remarkable women, their triumphs and their tragedies, their joys and their sorrows. Let us remember that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has an extraordinary capacity for resilience and renewal. And let us draw strength and inspiration from the example of those who came before us, facing the challenges of their age with grace, courage, and an unshakable determination to leave their mark upon the world. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. May the tales of medieval queenship be a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, the human spirit can soar to extraordinary heights. And may we all find within ourselves that same spark of resilience and hope that guided these remarkable women through the trials and tribulations of their age. For in the end, their stories are our stories, a testament to the enduring power of the human experience, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, light and hope can always be found. As we've seen, life for royal women in the Middle Ages was often a precarious balancing act between duty, danger, and fleeting moments of influence. But perhaps no queen exemplifies this tumultuous existence quite like Marguerite of Provence. Born in 1221 to the Count of Provence, Marguerite was married off at the tender age of 13 to King Louis IX of France, 20 years her senior. She arrived in the strange northern court speaking no French, surrounded by suspicious courtiers who scorned her Provençal entourage. Young and isolated, Marguerite nevertheless threw herself into the role of queen, bearing 11 children over the course of her marriage. But Marguerite's real trial came in 1248, when Louis set off on the Seventh Crusade, determined to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims. Appointed regent in her husband's absence, the 27-year-old queen suddenly found the weight of the entire French kingdom resting on her slim shoulders. It was a daunting task. With the king away, unrest simmered among the nobles, and the people chafed under heavy taxes levied to fund the crusade. Marguerite had to use all her wit and charm to keep the peace, making strategic appointments, negotiating with fractious lords, and representing the monarchy with grace and steel. But even as she grew into her power, danger lurked around every corner. Assassins were an ever-present threat. One of Marguerite's own cousins was murdered in his bed, and there was always the risk that Louis might not return from the crusade at all, leaving her son's claim to the throne vulnerable. Thankfully, Louis did come back in 1254, his army decimated by battle and disease. But Marguerite's relief was short-lived. A few years later, the pious king announced his intention to embark on yet another crusade. This time, over Marguerite's strenuous objections, he insisted she accompany him. And so in 1270, the 49-year-old queen found herself on a ship bound for Tunis, knowing full well the perils that lay ahead. Her worst fears were realized when dysentery swept through the crusader camp, striking down king and commoner alike. Louis IX breathed his last in a sweltering tent outside the walls of Tunis, leaving Marguerite grief-stricken and alone in a foreign land, far from home. But even in her despair, the queen summoned her strength one last time. With the same fortitude that had seen her through decades of tumult, Marguerite rallied the crusaders and negotiated a treaty with the emir of Tunis. Only then did she accompany her husband's body back to France for burial in the Basilica of Saint-Denis. Marguerite spent her final years in quiet piety, withdrawing to a convent she had founded. She had endured a lifetime of uncertainty and loss, always striving to hold the center amid the chaos. Her story reminds us of the remarkable resilience of these medieval queens, who navigated the razor's edge between power and peril with grace under unimaginable pressure. But Marguerite of Provence was far from the only royal woman to leave her mark on the Middle Ages. Across the Channel in England, another formidable queen was carving her own path through the tangle of medieval politics. Her name was Eleanor of Castile, and she was in many ways the archetypal medieval queen, beautiful, pious, and utterly devoted to her husband, King Edward I. But beneath that conventional surface beat the heart of a truly exceptional woman. Like so many royal brides, Eleanor was sent to England at a young age, betrothed to the future Edward I when she was just 12 years old. But this Spanish infanta quickly adapted to her new home, winning widespread admiration for her grace, learning and charity. Unusually for the time, Edward and Eleanor seem to have enjoyed a genuinely loving and respectful marriage. The king relied heavily on his wife's counsel, entrusting her with key diplomatic missions and even the running of the government when he was away on military campaigns. In fact, Eleanor spent much of her marriage on the move, accompanying Edward on his endless wars and royal progresses. This was no small thing at a time when travel was slow, arduous, and fraught with danger, especially for a woman who was almost constantly pregnant. But Eleanor took to the road with aplomb, overseeing a huge household staff and earning a reputation for her tireless work ethic. Rare for a queen, she even joined Edward on crusade to the Holy Land in 1270, sharing the hardships of the campaign trail. However, it was in times of crisis that Eleanor truly shone. When Edward was wounded by a poisoned dagger in the Holy Land, she famously sucked the venom from his arm, saving his life at the risk of her own. And when their first son died in infancy, Eleanor was a rock of comfort for the grieving Edward. But perhaps Eleanor's defining moment came in 1290, as she and Edward journeyed north to suppress a Scottish rebellion. After months of hard travel, the 49-year-old queen fell gravely ill with a fever, probably brought on by the harsh conditions. As she lay dying in a village near Lincoln, Eleanor gathered her strength to dictate her will and bid farewell to her stricken husband. Devastated by her loss, Edward ordered an elaborate funeral procession to carry her body back to London, erecting the famous Eleanor crosses at each stopping point. Today, those elegant stone crosses still stand as a testament to a truly remarkable medieval queen, one who combined piety, intelligence, and an indomitable spirit to leave an indelible mark on English history. Through the stories of women like Marguerite of Provence and Eleanor of Castile, we catch a glimpse of the complex realities of life for royal women in the Middle Ages. These were not delicate hothouse flowers, but rather strong, savvy, and resilient figures who navigated the treacherous currents of medieval politics with skill and determination. Yet even as we admire their fortitude, we must remember the steep price they paid for their lofty status. In a world where royal women were valued primarily as marriage pawns and broodmares, even the most privileged among them faced a lifetime of uncertainty, danger, and loss. From the ever-present threat of childbirth to the constant jockeying for power and influence, the life of a medieval queen was a tightrope walk over a bottomless abyss. One false step, one untimely death or shift in fortune could send even the most carefully constructed life tumbling into chaos. And yet, for all the perils they faced, these royal women found ways to shape their own destinies and leave their mark on history. Whether as patrons of the arts, savvy political operators, or simply steadfast companions to their kingly husbands, queens like Marguerite and Eleanor carved out spheres of influence that extended far beyond the confines of their castle walls. In the end, perhaps that is the most enduring lesson we can take from the lives of medieval royal women, that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, The human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience, ingenuity, and grace. These were women who bore the weight of crowns and kingdoms on their shoulders, and did so with a strength and dignity that echoes down through the centuries. So the next time you find yourself wandering through the drafty halls of a medieval castle or admiring the effigy of a long-dead queen, take a moment to remember the remarkable women who once breathed life into those stone walls. Theirs was a world of unimaginable grandeur and danger, of soaring triumphs and crushing defeats. But through it all, they endured, and in doing so, they left us a legacy of courage, resilience, and indomitable spirit that still has the power to inspire us today. As Marguerite of Provence's story illustrates, even the grandest royal pilgrimages could take a harrowing turn. The perils of travel in the medieval era were many, from treacherous roads to the risk of ambush, disease, and shipwreck. Yet for royal women, pilgrimage wasn't just an act of piety, it was a rare chance for adventure beyond the confines of the castle walls. Isabella of France, wife of King Edward II, embarked on a different kind of journey, one that would lead her down a dark and twisted path. Born into the French royal family, Isabella was renowned for her beauty and intelligence. In 1308, at the tender age of 12, she was wed to Edward in a grand ceremony meant to seal an alliance between England and France. But their marriage was troubled from the start. Edward was a weak and frivolous king, more interested in lavish entertainments and the company of his male favourites than in matters of state. He showered his friend Piers Gaveston with titles and riches, sparking the ire of his barons. Isabella, meanwhile, found herself increasingly sidelined and humiliated at court. As tensions mounted, Isabella bided her time and plotted her revenge. In 1325, she convinced Edward to allow her to travel to France, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. But once across the Channel, Isabella revealed her true intentions. She began gathering supporters and openly took Roger Mortimer, a powerful English nobleman, as her lover. Together, Isabella and Mortimer raised an army and invaded England, determined to depose Edward and rule in his stead. The king fled London, but was soon captured. In a sordid twist, Edward was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, where legend has it he met a grisly end, a red-hot poker thrust into his bowels. With Edward out of the way, Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled England for several years. The she-wolf of France, as Isabella came to be known, had overthrown a king and installed her teenage son, Edward III, as a puppet monarch. It was a stunning reversal of fortune, and a testament to Isabella's determination and political acumen. But power is a fickle mistress, and Isabella's grip on the reins of state would not last forever. As Edward III came of age, he grew resentful of his mother's domineering ways and Mortimer's arrogance. In 1330, the young king staged his own coup, arresting Mortimer and having him executed for treason. Isabella was spared, but stripped of her lands and wealth, and sent to live out her days in a comfortable exile. Isabella's story is a stark reminder that even the most influential of medieval queens were ultimately dependent on the whims of men, whether husbands, sons, or lovers. The same wits and wiles that could elevate a woman to dizzying heights of power could just as easily be her undoing. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the lives of royal women began to change in subtle but significant ways. The Renaissance ushered in new ideas about education and the arts, and noble ladies increasingly pursued learning for its own sake. Queens like Elizabeth I of England and Isabella I of Castile would wield power in their own right, reshaping the political landscape of Europe. Yet even as the old feudal order crumbled, medieval ideals of femininity and queenship cast a long shadow. royal women were still prized for their beauty, their fertility, and their piety above all else. They navigated a treacherous world where power was precarious and danger lurked around every corner. From Matilda's tenacious fight for the English crown to Isabella's ruthless bid for vengeance, the stories of medieval queens are filled with drama, intrigue, and astonishing resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. These women were more than just pretty faces or political pawns. They were mothers, warriors, scholars, and leaders in their own right. And so we come to the end of our journey through the turbulent lives of royal women in the Middle Ages. In drafty halls and sumptuous chambers, on windswept battlefields and arduous pilgrimages, these remarkable ladies left an indelible mark on history. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of their triumphs and lament their tragedies, and marvel at the indomitable spirit that carried them through an age of iron and blood. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams of fair maidens and fierce queens. As the sun began to set over the rolling English countryside, casting a warm glow on the stone walls of the castle, we return once more to our exploration of the lives of royal women in the Middle Ages. The halls of power were often lonely and perilous places for even the most privileged of ladies. One such formidable woman was Isabella of France, who would come to be known as the she-wolf of France for her tenacity and cunning. Born into the French royal family in 1295, Isabella was married off to King Edward II of England at the tender age of 12 as part of a diplomatic alliance. But their marriage was tumultuous from the start. Edward was rumoured to prefer the company of his male favourites, particularly the unpopular Piers Gaveston, over that of his young bride. Isabella, feeling scorned and isolated in a foreign court, was left to navigate the treacherous waters of English politics largely on her own. But navigate them she would, with a skill and determination that would make her one of the most influential figures of the 14th century. As tensions mounted between Edward and his barons, who resented the power and influence he bestowed upon Gaveston, Isabella found herself caught in the middle. She reportedly pleaded with her husband to send Gaveston away for his own safety, but Edward refused. In 1312, the barons took matters into their own hands and had Gaveston executed, much to the king's anguish and rage. In the years that followed, Isabella would bear Edward 4 children, including the future King Edward III. But their marriage continued to deteriorate, exacerbated by Edward's ineffective rule and the growing influence of his new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. By 1325, Isabella had had enough. Under the pretext of negotiating a peace treaty with France, Isabella travelled to her homeland and refused to return. There she began plotting to depose her husband with the aid of her lover, Roger Mortimer, and her son, Prince Edward. In 1326, they invaded England with a small army, quickly gaining support from disaffected nobles. Facing little resistance, Isabella and Mortimer seized power, forcing Edward II to abdicate in favour of his son. The deposed king was imprisoned and later died under mysterious circumstances, with many speculating that he had been murdered on Isabella's orders. For the next 4 years, Isabella and Mortimer would effectively rule England as regents for the young Edward III. It was a remarkable reversal of fortune for a woman who had begun her life as a political pawn. Through her intelligence, perseverance, and bold actions, Isabella had become one of the most powerful figures in England, subverting the traditional gender roles of her time. Her story serves as a reminder that even in the male-dominated world of medieval politics, there were women who found ways to exert their influence and shape the course of history. But Isabella's grip on power was not to last. As Edward III came of age, he grew resentful of Mortimer's control over his government. In 1330, the young king staged a coup, having Mortimer arrested and executed. Isabella, while spared her lover's fate, was effectively removed from power and spent the remainder of her life in comfortable retirement. As night falls over the peaceful English landscape, we are reminded of the many royal women like Isabella, who navigated the complex and often treacherous world of medieval politics. Their stories are ones of resilience, courage, and the unending struggle for agency in a society that often sought to deny it to them. In our next tale, we will meet another remarkable woman whose piety and patronage would leave an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of medieval England. Philippa of Hainault, wife of Edward III, may not have wielded a sword or led armies into battle, but her influence would be felt in the realms of art, literature, and religion for generations to come. As we prepare to explore Philippa's story, let us take a moment to reflect on the lives of these royal women, the challenges they faced, the triumphs they achieved, and the legacies they left behind. In a world that was so often set against them, their determination and strength continue to inspire us to this day. But for now, let us rest and allow the gentle embrace of sleep to transport us back to a time long past, where the stone walls of castles stood tall against the horizon, and the echoes of history whispered through the ages. Good night, and pleasant dreams. As we reflect on the precarious positions, political pawning, and lack of autonomy that marked the lives of royal women in medieval times, it's worth taking a closer look at some of the strong-willed queens who managed to carve out real spheres of influence despite the odds stacked against them. One of the most notable examples is Isabella of France, whose story is as dramatic and tumultuous as any soap opera plot. Born into the French royal family in 1295, Isabella was married off to King Edward II of England at the tender age of 12 as part of a diplomatic alliance. But their marriage was far from a fairy tale romance. Edward was notorious for his close male favourites, including the unpopular Hugh Despenser the Younger. As tensions mounted, Isabella found herself increasingly sidelined and mistreated by her husband and his inner circle. But rather than resign herself to a life of misery, this feisty French princess decided to take matters into her own hands. In 1325, Isabella travelled to France under the guise of a diplomatic mission, but it soon became clear that she had other plans in mind. Joining forces with her lover, the exiled English baron Roger Mortimer, Isabella raised an army and launched an invasion of England to depose her husband. Talk about a woman scorned. Their campaign was a resounding success. Edward II was forced to abdicate the throne in favour of his young son, Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer ruling as regents. For a few short years, this formidable pair held the reins of power in England. It was a remarkable reversal of fortune for a woman who had once been little more than a pawn in the political machinations of men. But power is a fickle thing, and Isabella's glory days were not to last. As Edward III came of age, he grew resentful of his mother and her lover's influence. In 1330, he staged his own coup, arresting Mortimer and executing him for treason. Isabella was spared, but forced into a quiet retirement, living out the rest of her days in relative obscurity. While Isabella's story is certainly one of the more dramatic examples, she was far from the only medieval queen to wield real political clout. In fact, during times of war or crusades, when kings were often away for long periods, it was not uncommon for queens to step up and rule as regents in their stead. One such queen was Blanche of Castile, who served as regent of France on 2 occasions during the 13th century. A Spanish princess by birth, Blanche was married to King Louis VIII of France at the age of 12. When Louis died just 12 years later, Blanche found herself in the challenging position of ruling on behalf of her young son, Louis IX. Despite facing opposition from rebellious barons who resented being governed by a woman, Blanche proved to be a capable and effective ruler. She quelled uprisings, negotiated treaties, and even personally led troops into battle when necessary. Under her guidance, France enjoyed a period of relative stability and prosperity. Blanche would once again take up the mantle of leadership when her son embarked on the Seventh Crusade in 1248. For 6 years, she governed France as regent, steering the country through the challenges of her son's prolonged absence. By the time Louis IX returned in 1254, Blanche had cemented her reputation as one of the most powerful and influential women of her time. Of course, not all medieval queens were able to translate their positions of prominence into real political power. Many found themselves constrained by the same rigid gender roles and expectations that limited the lives of women throughout society. For example, Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of King Edward IV of England, faced significant backlash for her perceived influence over her husband. As a commoner who had married into royalty, Elizabeth was resented by the old nobility who saw her family's rise to prominence as a threat to their own power. Despite the fact that Edward clearly relied on Elizabeth as a trusted advisor and confidant, she was painted as a grasping, ambitious woman who had overstepped her bounds. After Edward's death, Elizabeth's enemies wasted no time in turning against her, imprisoning her and executing her brother and sons on trumped-up charges of treason. So while some medieval queens were able to defy the odds and carve out real spheres of influence, they still had to tread carefully in a world that was deeply suspicious of female power. The precarious nature of their positions meant that even the most capable and accomplished women could find themselves quickly toppled from grace. It's a harsh reality that speaks to the incredible challenges faced by royal women in the Middle Ages. Theirs was a world of constant uncertainty, where the fortunes of even the most high-born ladies could shift on a dime. And yet, in the face of such adversity, many still managed to leave their mark on history, paving the way for the slow but steady march towards greater gender equality in the centuries to come. As we close out our exploration of the lives of medieval queens, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the incredible resilience and strength that these women displayed in the face of unimaginable hardship. From political pawns to powerful regents, their stories serve as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. So the next time you find yourself wandering through a drafty old castle or admiring a centuries-old tapestry, take a moment to remember the incredible women who once walked those same halls and whose legacies continue to inspire us to this day. Because while the world of medieval royalty may seem impossibly distant from our own, the courage and determination of these remarkable queens is something that still resonates across the ages. As Queen Philippa of Hainault's story illustrates, medieval royal women who embraced the roles of pious patron and intercessor could wield a form of soft power and leave a lasting cultural legacy. But others sought a more direct route to political influence, stepping beyond the traditional queenly sphere to pursue their ambitions, for better or for worse. One of the most dramatic examples of a queen claiming hard power is the turbulent tale of Isabella of France. Born in 1295, Isabella was the daughter of King Philip IV of France. At the tender age of 12, she was sent to England to wed the 23-year-old King Edward II. It was an arrangement intended to foster peace between the two kingdoms, but it planted the seeds of future strife. Edward II proved an inept and frivolous ruler who infuriated the English nobility by indulging his male favourites with undue influence and wealth. Poor Isabella not only had to contend with a feckless husband, but found herself sidelined at court by his companions, like the infamous Piers Gaveston. Her humiliation mounted as Edward neglected his husbandly duties to the point that some questioned whether their firstborn son was truly his heir. Tensions finally boiled over in 1325 when Isabella, now a frustrated queen in her 30s, travelled to France on a diplomatic mission. There, she made a fateful alliance, partnering with her exiled lover Roger Mortimer to amass an invasion force. In a shocking turn of events, Isabella landed on English shores in 1326, declaring her intent to depose Edward as an unfit ruler. Astonishingly, the royal couple's own teenage son, the future Edward III, sided with his mother in the coup. The hapless king was quickly overwhelmed. He was forced to abdicate the throne and was later brutally murdered, almost certainly at Isabella and Mortimer's command. For 4 years, the rebel queen ruled as regent for her young son, exacting vengeance on her enemies and richly rewarding her supporters. It was a heady period of female power that upended all notions of what a highborn woman and royal wife could do. But Isabella's flagrant affair with Mortimer and her increasingly ruthless actions alienated the nobles. When Edward III came of age in 1330, he seized control by staging his own palace coup. The Dowager Queen was initially confined to house arrest, although she eventually reconciled with her son and lived to a ripe old age. Isabella of France's story is a reminder of just how much was at stake in the game of medieval politics that royal women were thrust into. Her daring actions make her stand out from so many of her contemporaries who were shuffled around as passive pawns. She took her fate into her own hands in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Yet Isabella's rise and fall also illustrates the fine line that medieval queens had to walk. Taking too much power openly could provoke a backlash, as there was an underlying discomfort with female autonomy. A queen was meant to influence, not to overtly rule. The most skillful found ways to exercise power within the limits of their prescribed roles. As we've explored, whether taking dramatic action like Isabella or finding subtler avenues to effect change, medieval royal women were never mere decorative consorts. They were political players in their own right, constantly navigating a treacherous world of shifting alliances, intrigues, and dangers. It was a harsh existence in many ways, but one that gave rise to some truly remarkable individuals. So next time you find yourself touring a grand medieval castle or admiring the delicate beauty of an illuminated manuscript, spare a thought for the royal women behind the scenes. They may often be reduced to footnotes in the history books, but their stories deserve to be told. Because in many ways, it is their quiet struggles and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds that lend texture to the complex tapestry of the medieval world. And with that, we draw our tales of these formidable royal women to a close. If you've enjoyed stepping back into the halls of medieval power, do consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. There are so many more fascinating corners of history for us to explore together. But for now, let the hypnotic whir of the spinning wheel lull you gently to slumber, perchance to dream of fair maidens and soaring castle keeps. Sweet dreams, dear viewer. Until next time, farewell.